room for gender diversity in school health services and sex education. My name is Suzanne Mackey with the School-Based Health Alliance, and we are happy to be hosting this webinar with our organizational partners, Gender Spectrum and GLSEN. A few reminders for today. Everyone is in listen-only mode. This webinar is being recorded, and the link to the recording and PDF of the slides will be emailed later this afternoon. We do want to hear your questions. To ask a question during the session, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. I'm happy to be joined by my colleagues Kim Westheimer at Gender Spectrum and Rebecca Mui at GLSEN, who will be our presenters for today. I want to take a moment to introduce each of our organizations. The School-Based Health Alliance is a national nonprofit organization that serves as the voice for school-based healthcare across the country, including the 2,500 school-based health centers. We have individual, organizational, and state affiliate members, and we engage them in programmatic initiatives, TA, training, and advocacy to advance the field. Now I'm going to let my colleague Kim introduce Gender Spectrum.
Thanks, Suzanne. I'm so glad to be part of this webinar and to be partnering with the School-Based Health Alliance and also with GLSEN. Gender Spectrum is an organization that's been around for about 12 years. Our mission is to create a gender-inclusive world for all children and youth. We're located in the Bay Area, and we're a national organization. To meet our mission, we work with many different groups. We do in-person and online education for professionals and families, online groups for families and youth. We have an annual conference every summer, and a conference for families and youth, as well as a professional symposium. And we also have a multitude of resources that you can access and download at genderspectrum.org. Thanks. Rebecca?
Yeah, so I'm here representing GLSEN. We are a national organization focusing on LGBTQ young people in schools, K-12. We have a research department, which I'll be sharing some statistics from later. I work in our education and youth programs department. We have professional development through our chapter network, and also free resources that you can find on our website. We have a student leadership. You can see our amazing young National Student Council members, which we have 18 this year from across the country. We also have a policy department that's based in DC, and they work on our advocacy. And we also have, like I mentioned, 40 local chapters. They're doing the work on the ground.
Thanks, Rebecca. So we are going to start the webinar with an overview of some gender terminology, highlight key research on LGBTQ youth experiences, go over the guiding principles for health and sex ed, and share some resources and discuss next steps. We do have a lot of content to cover, but we will have time for some Q&A at the end. These are our learning objectives for the webinar. And I do want to mention that this webinar is supported by a CDC cooperative agreement. And the focus of this cooperative agreement is centered around the 3 school-based approaches to HIV and STD prevention, which include health education, health services, and safe and supportive environments. So I want to get started with a poll question to get a sense of who is in the room and what your various roles are in your school or organization. Just bear with me one second. Okay, so I'm hoping that everyone can see. Okay, I see people starting to respond. So the options listed here, so teacher, primarily K through 5, 6 through 8, or grades 9 through 10, school mental health professional, school nurse, administrator, school health teacher, staff at a school-based health center, administrator at school-based health center sponsoring organization, or administrator, educator, or direct service staff at a community-based organization. And I realize this probably does not encompass everyone who is in the room. We had a limit to 10 options here. So I know there are probably some groups of people who are not included. I know there are a number of parents who are on this webinar as well. So apologies that we didn't get a category in here for you. But it looks like we have a good number of people in the administrator, educator, or direct service staff at a community-based organization. So about 41% of people on this webinar. And then we also have a good number of school-based health center staff, school mental health professionals, school administrators. So it looks like we have a pretty good mix of folks. So I'm going to end the polling, share results. So it looks like predominantly the bottom category of folks is what we have most for today. All right, so I'm going to stop that. Close out that poll. And so now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Becca at GLSEN.
Thank you, Suzanne. So I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint here and share my sound. Great, so I'm going to talk a little bit about gender terminology to start off this webinar. And before we get into the terms, we'd like to begin this presentation with a note on intersectionality, which is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. We need to have an intersectional framework when supporting LGBTQ and gender diverse students. There's a history of whitewashing LGBTQ identity and advocacy, and it's important to name that LGBTQ students are students of color, are students with disabilities, and often hold multiple marginalized identities. While we're here to discuss combating transphobia and genderism and homophobia, we're also working against racism, sexism, ableism, classism, etc., and the ways that they intersect. In terms of gender terminology, it's important that we have a common language and a framework for this conversation and these supports that we'll present later. So I'm showing the definition for gender. It's important to note that gender is both constructed and socially constructed and also has very real lived implications every day. A term to note is cisgender, so a person whose gender identity is aligned or the same with the sex that they were assigned at birth. And then transgender trans is an umbrella term that describes people whose gender identity does not match. And we will talk a little bit more in the next slide. So this is a visual that GLSEN created to talk a little bit about some common language around gender and gender terminology. And the first term that's really important when you're talking about gender identity is about gender is gender identity. And that's how you identify and see yourself. So that's why it is inside of the triangle, it is inside of folks and is represented here by a brain. So you might identify as a woman or a man, as agender, genderqueer, or non-binary, or there might not be a specific term that folks use to identify their gender, or they might use a term today that doesn't seem to fit later. Now, your sex assigned at birth is what the medical community labels a person when they're born. And this is largely based on genitalia. A person will be assigned male, female, or intersex. And it's important to note also that it's a person who may be found to be intersex or to have intersex anatomy later in puberty, later, or sometimes not at all. Now, gender expression is when gender gets really fun, in my opinion. So it's a time when you get to really show your gender. And while you can have, the same way that we have facial expressions to show and communicate feelings that we have inside, we can use our gender expression to communicate our gender to other people. So it includes the way that we talk, our mannerisms, how we interact with other people, our clothing, accessories, hairstyles, and sometimes even activities we enjoy. It's important to have an understanding that gender identity and gender expression are not the same thing, and that folks shouldn't use gender expression to guess or infer a person's gender identity. Both of these exist on spectrums as well. Now, gender attribution is a term that's not often talked about, but that is really important when we're thinking about gender, and also when we're thinking about cisgender privilege and the ways that our gender communicates to other folks and the privileges we have to move around the world. So I'll just use myself quickly as an example. I identify as a cis woman, and I was assigned female at birth. My gender expression has a range along the spectrum of masculine to feminine, but I do identify as a femme. And my gender attribution, particularly because I work in an LGBTQ organization and I live in Brooklyn, I'm lucky enough that a lot of these things are aligned and I'm perceived and interacted with in ways that feel good to me and that I welcome. Now, that all of those things being aligned, and the more aligned that they are, shows the amount of cis privilege that I get to use as I move through the world. And so it's just important to consider for the folks that we're trying to serve, particularly when we're thinking about making room for gender diversity, how aligned these things are, if particularly looking at gender identity, expression, and attribution. Those things are all aligned for folks, and they can be interacted with in the way that they want and that feels good to them and that they feel welcome and affirmed. Is that true for them at school, inside of the clinic or the classroom where they're being interacted with? And in what ways can we make that happen? Now, although we're talking about and mentioning cis privilege and supports for gender diversity and gender diverse humans, it's really important to note that we all have a gender identity and we express our gender, and that is not just specific to trans and gender nonconforming young people. So we're going to take just a quick second to think about your own gender identity as we move through this presentation. So what is your gender identity today? And then consider what your gender identity was when you were in first grade. In terms of expression and the myriad of ways through our accessories, hairstyles, activities, clothing, mannerisms, how is your gender expression kind of on that spectrum, again, from masculine to feminine? And what was your gender expression like in first grade? When we do this, sometimes people report that, in first grade, they had more freedom. They were able to express their gender in a way that wasn't as confined into the binary or confined into a line with the sex they were assigned at birth because they were a child, because they were younger. And other people report sometimes that first grade was a time when they felt less in control and when their family members were picking out their outfits or they had a uniform that they had to wear that didn't fit. And so it's important to kind of think about those early memories and how they may shape us today. And if you can, speaking of earliest memories, really think about what was the first memory you had of gender? How did you first know your gender identity, and what were those earliest memories? Now, regardless of if these are some conversations or some reflection that you're doing for the first time, or if this is something that's been on your mind for a while, somebody was thinking about your gender identity, probably even before you were born. We live in a culture where it's really common to ask when a human is about to be born, is it a boy or a girl? As if those are the only two options. And beyond that, there's implications for gender stereotypes in this binary. So it's not just, we're not just asking, is your baby going to be assigned female or assigned male at birth? We're also implying here colors that they might like. Are they a little man or a little miss? And part of these supports and these conversations that we'll be having is beginning to challenge that, wondering what it means, and the pressures that we're putting on young people who are assigned male at birth and people who are assigned female at birth to live up to and be boxed into stereotypes. And so as we're considering this, we're looking really at genderism or gender binarism, and this idea that there are only two ways to exist, that people are women who express their gender in a feminine way and were assigned female at birth, and then there are men who express their gender in a masculine way and were assigned male at birth. Whereas we know that there is, these are not the only two categories for humans to exist in, although we do live in a society that prioritizes and these boxes. But we're here to consider and to really center the spectrum of identities for each of these aspects of gender. Now, it's a lot of information, it's a lot to think about, and so we like to pause at this point. Sometimes when people are learning about terminology, it can be overwhelming, and so we want to just note that it's true, there is a lot of gender terminology. This is just a brief overview of some important terms, but I could go on and on about terms and identity terms and terms around gender, and it's important for us to be excited and happy about those changes, particularly because some of the reason that is changing is that people who have these identities are finally being given both mainstream attention and agency to define themselves. And so that's one of the reasons that the terminology around gender is changing so rapidly. And in addition to gender, terminology is always changing in English. We have a language that is evolving. That's why binge watching is now in the dictionary. And that is just the way that our language evolves, and it is a common thing in general. And really, it's our job as cis allies or as allies in this work to not feel like we have mastered a language, but really just to know that the language is fluid and to be open to change and be ready to keep learning. Now, I like to end by focusing on LGBTQ young people and gender fluid young people and letting them speak for themselves. So I'm going to play a quick video by one of our National Student Council members talking about being gender fluid.
I identify as gender fluid, and to me, that means my place on the gender spectrum varies over time. That means I don't necessarily have to fit into the box of being a girl or being a boy or even like identifying with a gender or being binary in general. It also means that I don't have to like conform to people's idea of gender roles and gender expressions. It also means that I can feel comfortable with myself, whatever makes me happy. I don't have to worry about being different. I don't have to worry about fitting in with the girls or the guys. I can just do me.
And that's really our goal in this work, is to help people to, as Miguel says, like do me, to be themselves. I'm going to switch gears now and talk a little bit about some of the research and the data around LGBTQ student experience. So this comes from GLSEN's research study called From Teasing to Torment. It's a revision of a study that we had done in 2005, and this one came out in 2015. So we looked at general population here, not specific to LGBTQ youth, to look at school climate. And something that we found from that is that we were able to look at LGBTQ student experiences in relation to their non-LGBTQ peers. And one example of those findings was not that they were less likely, 3 times less likely to say that they planned on finishing high school. From this study, we also found some specific findings to sex education, in really that it was less useful for LGBTQ students. Only about half of LGBTQ students reported that they found their sex ed useful at all. And 1 in 17 students said that they didn't see students like them or LGBTQ students represented in their class. This survey is GLSEN's landmark survey that comes out every 2 years. And it's a survey of just specifically LGBTQ youth. We had about 10,000 LGBTQ youth take this survey. It's our most recent one that just came out this spring. And we found that nearly 9 in 10 students were harassed or assaulted at school. And also that sexual orientation and gender expression were the most commonly targeted characteristics. And it is important to note that these are 2 different categories, sexual orientation and then also gender expression. But in terms of gender expression, looking at harassment and assault, we can see that more than half of the students were verbally harassed. And then we're also seeing high rates of physical harassment and assault. Not surprisingly, gender nonconforming students, or students who don't fit neatly into gender binary boxes, reported that they were twice as likely not to feel safe at school. In terms of all LGBTQ students, looking at their self-esteem and their sense of depression, we noticed that there were higher rates of depression for folks who had experienced discrimination and victimization. This is similarly found, this trend in terms of self-esteem. So that's LGBTQ students who had discriminatory practices or experienced victimization based on their sexual orientation or their gender expression reported lower levels of self-esteem. Now, it's important to note that these trends and these internal and external outcomes are related to victimization, not LGBTQ identity. LGBTQ students who were in affirming learning environments did not report any of these negative outcomes. It's really based on the experiences of harassment and discrimination and this victimization that lead to these outcomes in a hostile school climate. But with the victimization, we found that there were higher rates of depression, anxiety, lower self-esteem, and then also which led to educational outcomes, so that these students were less likely to say that they plan to finish high school, that they plan to continue on to secondary education. They felt less connected to their schools. They had lower GPAs, and then were much more likely to report that they had missed school recently, largely due to feeling unsafe. Another thing that our survey trends is institutional support, such as inclusive curriculum. And it is important to note that we have seen an increase in inclusion and even positive representation for LGBTQ people over time. However, this isn't necessarily related to health curriculum. And to look at that, we wanted to pull up the school health profiles from CDC in 2016. And from this graph, we saw that many schools did not include sexual orientation or gender identity or expression in their curriculum. And this is just secondary schools. And then part of this and a related issue is professional development for educators. So we're finding that many teachers do not receive professional development in order to be prepared to create a curriculum and support the particular needs of LGBTQ students. This is partly related to legislation that I want to just briefly go over. It's called No Promo Homo laws, and they're in 7 different states currently. And these restrict particularly health education in most cases. And in these states that have these laws, LGBTQ people are less likely to be included in curriculum, and the teachers are less likely to engage in supportive activities. So this is a map of the states where these are currently existing. And if anyone is interested in more of that, we just put out a research brief on this, and I'd be happy to share that. We also found, not surprisingly, that LGBTQ students, because they're not having the curriculum and being taught in schools like their hetero peers, that they're more likely to go online to find their information. And this comes from GLSEN's study Out Online, the experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth on the internet. So we found that they were more likely to search sexuality, health, medicine, and HIV, STIs. And they reported most often that this was because they felt they had no one to talk to. So you can see the rates here that they're much more likely than their non-LGBTQ peers to be looking for this information. And once they're looking for it online, there is no regulation of what they're finding, how accurate the information and developmentally appropriate the information that they're finding is. It's really just that they're looking for it themselves. I also wanted to just show some of the risk factors among LGBTQ youth based on the CDC YRBS report. So this is really looking just at LGB students from 2015, but we did see, as compared to their heterosexual peers, they are more likely to have some of these negative risk factors. So being physically forced to have sex, experiencing sexual and physical dating violence, and then also more likely to engage in alcohol use. I also wanted to point out from the World Health Organization that transgender girls and women aged 13 to 19 had a HIV prevalence rating from 19 to 22%. And although this is preliminary data and our research department said to please contact them if you have more information, it is important to think about the supports that are needed. I wanted to end this again by, sometimes sharing the data can, while it is important to have that information on the experiences of queer and trans youth, it's also really important to end on their resiliency and their visibility, and to show that there are young queer people advocating for themselves. And so I'd like to just share this video of some trans youth talking about their own experiences and supports that they need to feel safe.
Not every trans person is the same, and not every trans person looks the same. When we represent trans people, we want to show every beautiful part of our community. In my school, we seem to have a problem where administration is only listening to the struggles of white trans students, and it is not listening to the struggles of trans students of color. And I cannot stress enough that it is important to identify the intersections between class and race and gender identity, and listen to the voices that are often being marginalized and erased within your school community and the entire country. Personally, I've had experiences where teachers assume that their classroom is full of heterosexual cisgender students, and that speaking about LGBT people is some sort of other or some hypothetical situation. I think a big thing is just kind of weeding in representation wherever you can. For example, like if you're teaching math class, you can have problem, instead of saying Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you can throw in some diversity and say Mr. and Mr. Smith, or Mrs. and Mrs. Smith, or even use a gender neutral term. So that's a big thing, just fitting in diversity wherever you can. I really believe that schools need to be open to listening to the voices of trans students of color within your schools and hearing what they need, because everyone is going to need something different, and the most important thing is to listen and hear these stories, hear these experiences, and hear what these people need. An all-gender bathroom is basically like a big sign to all LGBT students that differences are accepted. All-gender bathrooms don't exist just to accommodate trans people either. That's a misbelief. All-gender bathrooms are encouraging everybody is treated the same and not grouped according to how you may look or how you may express yourself. So if I see an all-gender bathroom, I immediately know that I'm accepted and that I'm in a safe place. And again, if you're at school, you need that safe place to be able to learn and to grow and to develop socially.
All right, thank you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
1 second. Okay, hi, and Becca, thank you for that presentation, and I want to acknowledge GLSEN, who continues to do such critical research and has been doing that for years. The presentation, and particularly the research, reminded me of the pressing need for gender-inclusive puberty and reproductive health education. This is something that will help students feel more engaged in school and feel more connection in school to their peers and to educators, and that's really critical. It's also critical in health centers and thinking about what messages we're giving students or young people about who they are and whether they exist or not. But before I go into this presentation, I want to do another poll and get a little sense from you about what you're doing already. I know that there are folks on this webinar who are already taking steps to be gender inclusive, and we have a poll question here to just get a sense of what you're already doing. And if your organization is not addressing this topic, first of all, we're glad that you're here. And this is also a time to think about how likely you think you are to be able to start addressing these topics soon, and also hopefully you'll come away from this webinar with some very concrete steps that you can take. So we have a lot of options here, so I'm going to read these, and you can pick more than one. So the question is, what's one thing your school, district, or organization has done to ensure that young people receive health information that's gender inclusive? Created resources with gender inclusive information, displayed relevant books, posters, or pamphlets that are inclusive of transgender and non-binary people, conducted staff training related to gender inclusion, reviewed health and other relevant curriculum to ensure that it is gender inclusive, reviewed policies and made changes if necessary to make them gender inclusive, communicated with other schools, districts, health centers, or organizations to learn what they are doing to be gender inclusive, supported or participated in research related to transgender and non-binary youth and health, none of the above, but we're ready to take steps now, or none of the above, and it's hard to imagine any of these in our near future. And again, this is far from a comprehensive list, but if you could just check the ones that are relevant, that'd be great, and then we'll get some information from that. Okay, so as I suspected, there's a lot happening already among the folks who are there. 69% of you have conducted staff training related to gender, created resources with gender inclusive content. 54% have reviewed health and other relevant curriculum to ensure that it's gender inclusive. And 47% have communicated with other schools, districts, health centers, or organizations to learn what they are doing to be gender inclusive. And I really like to see that, because there's no need to reinvent the wheel, and finding out what other organizations and schools and health centers are doing is a great way to move forward. So thank you for that. Okay. 1 second, just working on moving the slide forward. So I'm going to start by discussing this foundation and a framework that can be used to create gender inclusive puberty and reproductive health education. I do want to mention that what I'm going to be presenting is in alignment with the content of the National Sexuality Education Standards. I'm not going to go into details about these standards now, but I just want to highlight them as a valuable resource for you to explore, and you can access them at the website, The Future of Sex Ed. So here are 6 objectives of gender inclusive puberty and reproductive health education. Again, the need to achieve these are really clear from the research Becca highlighted, as well as from Gender Spectrum's work with schools and families over the last 12 years. And what's more, as we'll see later, these objectives are actually reachable within schools and health centers. So briefly, gender inclusive reproductive health and puberty ed establishes that every young person has a unique road they will travel as their bodies mature. Signals to the school community that every student's experience is deserving of celebration and respect. Makes visible the non-binary nature of gender. Helps transgender, non-binary, and gender-expansive students receive the information they need to be healthy. Speaks to healthy behaviors and practices for all students. And finally, ensures that all students see themselves and their future possibilities reflected in the curriculum. And that last one really sums it up and broadly encompasses everything that inclusive education has to offer. And to state what may be obvious, this type of education really benefits all students. Because all students benefit from learning about the diversity of gender and being reassured that their unique experiences are normal and that nothing about who they are stands in the way of them having a fulfilling future. So how do we get there? I want to start by introducing these 5 foundations of gender-inclusive puberty and reproductive health education. I'll list them all here and then describe each a little bit more fully. So 1, the first foundation is describing many pathways to adult bodies, describing many pathways to families, distinguishing patterns from rules, emphasizing physiology, not gender, and finally explaining non-binary aspects of hormones. So let's start with the first one, many pathways to adult bodies. The need for this message is clear. We know that many youth experience insecurities about their own growth and development, and many of us can remember having those feelings as well. Questions like, why is my body not changing more quickly? Why is my body changing so darn quickly? Why don't I have any hair down there? Why do I have so much hair down there? A constant comparison is made, thinking about some conception of normal that in reality doesn't exist. In reality, there's vast variations in puberty and sexual development, which are too often unacknowledged in health and sex education. Let's start with a simple example of facial hair. The degree to which someone grows facial hair, a commonly cited secondary sex characteristic for boys, is an example of a standard variation. In reality, though, some boys will grow almost no facial hair during that time, while some girls will grow facial hair. When those natural variations aren't acknowledged, young people who fall outside of the norm generally experience shame and secrecy, certain that there is something fundamentally wrong with them. These insecurities can follow a person through adulthood. Likewise, there are young people who experience precocious puberty and they're prescribed medication to delay the process till they get older. Some need medical intervention to produce the hormone levels needed to initiate or sustain puberty. And some young people may take hormones or hormone blockers to manage puberty in a manner that's consistent with their gender identity. All these are valid pathways to adult bodies, and they all deserve to be affirmed. Likewise, there are many pathways to families. Describing pathways to a family simply means acknowledging that there's lots of different ways that a family can be formed. This perspective includes an overview of the process of conception, the growth of an embryo, and other milestones of development that are typically included in puberty ed. But it doesn't limit the creation of a family just to that. It also includes information about egg donors, sperm donors, surrogacy, and adoption. All of this becomes part of the story by which children can come into the world. It creates a sense of possibility for all students to envision pathways for creating their own families. This knowledge is critical to young people who, for many reasons, will never have a child in the manner typically taught in puberty ed classes. It's also valuable for students who grew up in adoptive families or who have a strong desire to create a family without biological procreation, and those who simply aren't interested in having children. That's also a valid way to move forward. And now let's move to the idea of patterns versus rules. On a lighter note, if you were to look at this picture really quickly, you'd say it's a large group of sheep. And you'd be right that there's a large group of sheep here. But if you look a little bit closely, you'll see there's also this cute little dog in the middle. This notion of patterns versus rules doesn't diminish the fact that there are many sheep in the picture. It just says that sheep aren't the whole picture. And in fact, just knowing that there are sheep doesn't tell us much about who those sheep are, their experiences, how they feel about themselves and each other. But back to the topic at hand. Going back to the facial hair example, that illustrates the importance as well of patterns versus rule, and there's many other topics that can be understood more fully with this principle. For example, most people have physiology that is traditionally associated with being male or female, But some people are born intersex, which means that their physiology doesn't align with that's typically classified as male or female. And it's not so common for boys to take ballet or for girls to play competitive football, but that doesn't mean they do not or that they cannot. And most people who are born with physiology, try that again. And most people who are born with physiology typically associated with being male or with being girls or female are women, but some are not. When these differences are discussed without judgment, all students are given the opportunity to recognize themselves and their loved ones as a natural part of human diversity. Principle 4, or Foundation 4, is emphasizing physiology, not gender. I'll just give a shout out to this book, Sex is a Funny Word, which is one of the few books out there that discusses puberty in a way that is truly gender inclusive. So typically, one of the first lessons in puberty and reproductive health is a comparison between male and female bodies. It probably doesn't take much to conjure up the image of that standard line drawing of a penis and testicles described as male reproductive organs, or the vagina and ovaries described as female structures. A more gender-inclusive approach would use these drawings and instead of labeling their sex, would refer back to Principle 3 of patterns versus rules, and let young people know that while most people with a vagina and ovaries are girls/women, some are not. And while most people with a penis and testicles are boys or men, some are not. Teachers can focus on physiology without assigning or assuming genders. Rather than saying girls and women go through a process called menses that prepares the uterus for a fertilized egg to implant itself, they can simply refer to that diagram with a vagina and ovaries and say, here's how the pituitary glands and ovaries interact to start menses. This simple technique will help all students engage in the conversation and see their experiences represented, and hopefully change some of the data in future years that Becca just shared with us. The fifth foundation is to share the non-binary aspects of hormones. Again, sex hormones are typically taught about in health class in a binary manner. Females have estrogen and males have testosterone. But as with many things, this binary isn't accurate. Both of these hormones are found in most bodies, regardless of sex or gender. Discussing hormones' impact on bodies helps to describe how hormones come into play for all people, including people who are intersex, people with precocious or delayed puberty, as well as in relation to infertility or medical options for transgender people. So that's a lot of information in a short amount of time going through these 5 principles. And I will share them a slide with them again before I end it. You will be able to download these slides from the SBA. Oh, I have the review right here from the website. So again, just as a review, the foundations describe many pathways to adult bodies, many pathways to families, distinguish patterns from rules, emphasize physiology, not gender, and explain non-binary aspects of hormones. I'm just doing a time check here. Okay. There's one more aspect related to puberty education that I'd like to address, and it's a common question about, do you separate or not separate in terms of having gender segregated spaces? And just briefly, why are students generally separated? The reasons here are pretty clear. It's always been done that way. Some students will be uncomfortable. There's a fear that boys will giggle and show off, girls will be silent, or that, frankly, that parents will protest. And it's easy to conjure up an image of 5th grade students giggling and squirming with embarrassment as they sit among a group of gender diverse peers. But the notion that some students will be more comfortable in gender segregated classrooms, that may have some basis in reality. However, it doesn't consider the trade-offs and what's lost when you separate students. So what are the downsides? So if you separate students, they don't have the same opportunity to communicate about bodies and reproduction with others who aren't the same sex or gender. This is a skill that'll be useful in many contexts, in friendships, dating, or sex. And while these conversations may be challenging for some, having respectful conversations of this sort modeled in the classroom might actually make it easier for them in the future. Another possible consequence of segregated instruction is conveying to students that bodies unlike their own are somehow alien. This can stigmatize bodies that are different, and just think about the way that menstruation and women's sexuality is discussed in popular culture. At best, these portrayals and perceptions can lead to uninformed stereotyping, and that stereotyping at its worst can lead to disengagement and disrespect that are central to unhealthy and even violent relationships, and that really can't be more apropos than it is right now. Separating instruction based on bodies also reinforces strict notions of gender being binary and based solely on anatomy. Many young people will feel alienated by this, including those who are intersex and or transgender. I do want to make a caveat here because I think being absolute is generally, maybe absolutely not a good thing. And that I do want to say that I'm not saying here that there's never a reason to have groups specifically for boys or girls. But what I am saying is if you're going to do so, it's important to thoughtfully consider what's gained and what's lost in the process. And if you're concerned about, well, if we put the boys and girls and everybody else together in one room, that there's going to be problems, a few things about that. One is that there are common strategies that teachers are already using to do that work. One is setting clear ground rules, normalizing discomfort, allow for some giggling, acknowledge that it's normal, using an anonymous question box, and then also anticipating commonly asked questions and making sure that those commonly asked questions are read if the students don't ask those questions. And here are just a couple of quotes from a school district, from the Oakland Unified School District, where they've been doing a lot of work to create gender inclusive sexual health in general. And here's a quote from Ilsa Bertolini, who is the program manager for the sexual health education department in Oakland. And she said, "We're very proud of the professional development that we require of our 6th and 7th grade science teachers in Oakland. They practice talking about bodies without using gender. For many, this is very challenging at first because it goes against everything they've been taught, but by the end, they're doing so with ease. And the students, they get it right away. It's harder for adults, which is why the education is so important." And then they did a survey of the teachers who went through this training. And one of the science teachers said, "When I explained to my class that I was going to say a body with a penis and a body with a vulva to describe those diagrams, I noticed one of my students who doesn't identify as either gender let a deep breath go and smiled really big." Okay, I feel like I need that breathe slide that Becca had. But what I want to do just briefly in closing, because I know everybody likes to leave with some very concrete actions to take. Just 5 concrete actions that you can take to be more gender inclusive in your school, in your organization, in your health center, and things that you can do immediately. And this is not an exhaustive list because we would be exhausted if I had an exhaustive list. So one is to reflect on your own relationship to gender. Again, Becca started us with that, and the Gender Spectrum has a document you can get on our website called My Gender Journey, and it has a number of questions that you can use for self-reflection and also to join with others and reflect and discuss your own experiences with gender. Another is to learn about gender diversity. There's so much information that many of us don't know, and this is just one example of a place where you can learn more. The PBS Independent Lens has a website where the map that you see there and all of the little pins on it describe how different cultures through time and history have viewed gender in a non-binary way. And it can be very eye-opening for folks who don't know that information to see how widespread non-binary conceptions of gender have been over time. Third, make gender diversity visible. Find a book that has information that clearly signals something about gender diversity and have those books displayed. Have posters up. The diagram that Becca presented, and then also the All Genders Welcome sign you can get from our website. Have things up like that around. They'll go a long way to making people go, oh, this is a place that really is trying to be inclusive around gender. Use gender inclusive language, avoid stereotypes, interrupt stereotypes and discrimination, use inclusive language as all genders, use inclusive pronouns when they arrived, mix it up, use a lot of different pronouns, and finally avoid stereotypes and binaries. And also review school district forms and policies and health center policies. GLSEN has a great model law and policy on their website, and you can look at that. Gender Spectrum has an assessment that you can use to just see how inclusive is your space around gender, and maybe what are your next steps in terms of structural changes that you want to make in your organization. And finally, stay in touch. If information here, go to our websites. You can join the Gender Spectrum Lounge, which is an online community for parents, educators, students, professionals. We have, there's the GLSEN Education Educators Network, and then lots of resources on both of our websites. Okay, and now we're going to move to the Q&A portion of this.
All right, I'm going to read the first question that we have here. This is from Emma Cohen Westbrook. She asked, how do teachers respond to the students continuing to use boy and girl in their language? Do we ignore it, or do we explain why specifically we are doing this? I teach puberty with 5th and 6th graders and do my best to use non-gendered language, but I'm curious what you all have found to be most effective.
Can I just say, I'd be happy to start with that. We're not looking to not use the words boy or girl, to completely erase the language of gender from people's vocabularies. In fact, when you think about transgender young people who do identify as being a boy or a girl, it can be very important for them to be able to identify as being a boy or a girl. So we're not looking for completely gender neutral language. We're looking for language that actually is more expansive than that, and knows and recognizes that boys and girls aren't the only people in the room. So don't feel like you need to somehow take out words related to gender from your language. Yeah.
Absolutely. I would also say it is always a best practice to teach your students about what you're doing. I mean, these are things that we have to unlearn as adults, but it's still important that young people are in on the conversation and they have these conversations that we are also having, so that they know about gender neutral and gender inclusive language, so that when we say it's not just boys and girls, they know why and who we're talking.
Thank you, guys. Somebody else asked if we are going to share the slides, and yes, we will be sending an email out later this afternoon with a link to where a PDF of the slides as well as a recording of this webinar will be posted on the School-Based Health Alliance website. That will take a couple of days, but it will be available on our website. And we will also be sending out an evaluation as well, so we hope everyone can answer that too. All right, Sherry Haas, she asked, hey all, in our school district, we are in the process of reviewing HGD and health education and looking for best practice curriculum and resources. We are looking at Advocates for Youth 3R curriculum. Are there other great options? Do you guys want to just respond to what, I'm not familiar with what HGD stands for.
I don't know either.
It's just assuming like health guiding principle.
Sheree, let us know.
Okay. I can say that I would say that's a great start. That Advocates for Youth is incredible. Their resources are really LGBTQ affirming and inclusive, and their 3Rs curriculum is a great place to be starting.
Okay, human growth and development. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just echo that I think that's one of the best curriculum out there. And the other thing that I would add is that one of the reasons that Gender Spectrum developed that framework is to have something that can be applied to any health ed curriculum. And so that if you're mandated to use a curriculum that's not as inclusive, then that's a way to tailor that curriculum and have it be more inclusive.
And I'd also say Answer, they have Sex Etc., which is sex ed by young people for young people. And they have amaze.org, which is a website that has videos and is marketed for more like 10 to 13 around a lot of like puberty.
Great, thank you guys. Let's see if we have one more. Okay, got a couple more. And these Okay, we might not be able to take any more questions after these because we're almost at time, but let me try and get to these last three. Terry Brewer asked, as a parent of a non-binary teen, I'm wondering how teachers manage changing gender pronouns and first name of student they've had for years and have known by another name and pronoun, and whether this is part of the learning curve for educators.
Do you mind if I? It absolutely is part of the learning curve, but it's also part of their responsibility as educators. And GLSEN provides a lot of resources and support for educators around this area. And it is in many places legal to change particularly on school documents and school rosters, and to make sure that you're using the names and pronouns that are affirming to the students. And so they can reach out to us if they're looking for more information on that, but like absolutely that is part of, the educators might need support in it, but it is part of their responsibilities.
And if I could just add quickly that if, is there an echo coming through for?
Yeah, a little bit. Here, I'll mute myself.
If there's a real difference between an educator trying to make that change of name and pronouns and making a mistake. We can all make mistakes, and that really it's more an issue of intent, so that sometimes we all have a learning curve, and that's fine. But what's really critical is to help educators understand why this is so important. And then if they make a mistake every now and then, okay, we all make mistakes every now and then. But what's really critical is that their intent is to support students, and that's really the charge that educators are handed.
Thanks, Kim. Okay, the next question. Our local health department is looking to work with our school district to reconstruct our sexual health education curriculum. What would be some steps to encourage health educators or school nurses to integrate more inclusivity in their teaching, if some seem to be more uncomfortable with these changes?
Again, that's where I think professional development is just so important. And whether it's working with people locally in your area, working with organizations like Gender Spectrum or GLSEN, it's really critical for folks to have the time to both reflect on where they're coming from when they're considering gender and thinking about making these changes. And as an example that I gave from Oakland, to actually be able to practice, because it does take time to learn new information when you've been doing it one way for a long time. But in my experience, when educators are given the chance to approach this in a way that acknowledges, that meets them where they are, and provides them solid information about how to make these changes, that usually they're quite open to it. And I've seen much success in that area.
Yeah, I think, we live in a binary world that reinforces the gender binary. And so this understanding really is something that we need to have patience for and bring to people. But I think it is also important to use the professional development like Kim mentioned.
Thank you, guys. And then last question, where can we get information on how to organize LGBT group in our school district?
That's you.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. That's part of the supports that GLSEN works on. We have a youth engagement part of our organization, and we do a lot of GSA support and resources. So you can reach out to us for support with that.
All right, great. And I think those are all the questions that we have, and we're right on time at 3 o'clock. So I just want to thank everyone for attending this webinar, and I know there were many more people who registered, so we will send out that link so that they can view the webinar later. And if you could just look out for an email from us with the link to the recording and the slides, and also the link to the evaluation form, we would really appreciate if folks could complete our evaluation. So thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.